You're listening to the Sketchnote Army Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Rohde, the author of the Sketchnote Handbook and the Sketchnote Workbook, and this is the podcast where I chat with sketchnoters and visual thinkers and try to understand what makes them tick. Hey, are you looking for the ideal sketchbook for your sketchnoting practice? The Sketchnote Idea Book is the sketchbook designed for sketchnoters. Equipped with no bleed, no show-through paper, you can take almost any marker or pen you can throw at it. Get 10% off with code ARMY at airship.store. Hey everyone, it's Mike and I'm here with Jono Hey. Jono, welcome to the show. It's so good to have you.
Well, thanks, Mike. It's so good to finally meet you after all these years.
Yeah, it's great. We've connected years and years ago, specifically for a sample, or I guess a piece, one of your pieces that we included in this one of the Sketchnote handbooks, Sketchnote workbook books, because I thought your stuff was really cool and the way you thought about visualization was really interesting. So that's, I think, how we crossed paths initially, probably 10 years ago, almost.
I think it was probably about 10 years ago. Yeah, I came across your work from originally when you did the rework book.
Oh, that's right.
For that, which was also a long time ago.
Yeah, that was more like 15 years ago almost now. So crazy how time flies. Anyway, so that's how we cross paths. I've always loved your work, and I'm amazed at your prolific nature and your ability to continuously produce these sketchplanations. And if you are watching or listening and you've not heard of or seen Jono's sketchplanations, they're amazing. He basically visually represents often very complex ideas in simple ways, so you can sort of get the concept of the idea with some notes and such to help describe it. Is that a fair way to describe what your sketchplanations are?
Yeah, definitely. It's about taking a concept and trying to just represent it in a picture in a way that's sort of sticky and memorable and quick to get to grips with. And yeah, I think over the years I've definitely started adding a bit more layer of description, which you can take optionally, but you don't have to have it. That's the idea, is that you have that surface level. If it's interesting, you can dive in, and if not, carry on.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear sort of the origin story of that and sort of what is driving you to continue. But first, tell us a little bit about what you do and who you are, and then you can jump right into I always love to have people do their own origin story. So how did you end up doing what you're doing? Did you draw as a kid? Did somehow you snuck through school without it being shaken out of you, or how did that all begin? So start with who you are, what you do, and then where you came from.
Oh yeah. So as you say, I'm Jono, and I'm mostly here because of my work for Sketchplanations, which is a weekly newsletter working towards explaining the world one sketch at a time. With the illustration side, I've also had I was lucky enough to do some illustrations for Bill Gates's book recently,
good,
how to prevent the next pandemic, which was really cool. But it's all like the illustrations, Sketchplanations has all been sort of a side project which I've been doing now for the 10 years or so that we've crossed paths. In my day job, I run product development. So I've been a UX designer and I run product delivery. I'm now on my second startup, which has been really cool and a really interesting sort of parallel journey. And it feeds a lot of content and the sorts of things that come into Sketchplanations. You asked for the origin story, so I will go right back.
Okay,
I think
good.
I think it makes sense as to why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I think if I go back far enough, like I always used to quite like drawing, but I was never particularly good at art, in the sense that there were always better artists than me, but I was always quite good at like the maths and the science side of things. And so if I think back to what's high school in the US or A levels in the UK, I did a bunch of like science and maths based ones, and then I did art, and art was always the one which I was very happy to go spend my lunchtime working on my art homework. But of course I didn't do as well in my art as all the other stuff, and so what I ended up doing was design engineering, which is a lovely way to like blend the two things together, really. So you're trying to draw for a purpose, and you're trying to communicate things, come up with ideas, but then express them on paper. But they have to work as well. So you have to have the maths and the science bit right. I don't know who your heroes were growing up like, but Da Vinci was always one of mine. And it's quite difficult to, get the breadth of what evidently Leonardo da Vinci was able to do. But that for me was, when I was growing up, was always the ideal, like beautifully using his art to express like scientific or engineering concepts, which was cool. So in many ways, I think that sort of lives on in what I was still been trying to do. But yeah, so way back, I was good at the science and maths, and but I always enjoyed the art, and I was always interested also in like creative thinking. And so when I came out of university, I spent a lot of time working on creativity, really like design creativity. How do you come up with new cool ideas? And I was really interested in how we think. I got really into mind maps. So I used mind maps all the time, like when preparing for this, and mind maps are brilliant for like visual recording and sketchnoting. And I was so interested in it that I went over to UC Berkeley, where I did a PhD studying new product development.
Oh wow!
And that was a really nice combination. So they had a great program there where you have the engineering side, but then you have the business side from the business school there, and then you have sort of industrial design, which was a collaboration with the California College of the Arts. And so you bring all of that together, and then you want to come up with new products. But again, it's really about like communicating ideas, but in a ways that the ideas have to work. Like new products, they have to be feasible and they have to be buildable, But UC Berkeley, I think, was such an interesting place because I was also able to go explore, like sociology and research methods. I did some really interesting classes in the language school there with George Lakoff on metaphor. I was in the Berkeley Institute of Design, and that was they had a big focus on HCI, which is human computer interaction. And so there was lots of psychology concepts that people were bringing in and were going around the place. And of course I was involved with software, so like there was lots of different influences and I think you probably see pieces of all of those in the topics that I choose for Sketchnotations. After UC Berkeley, I found a fantastic company called Jump Associates. It was actually I did a class at Stanford, and the professor there works at Jump Associates. And they're a growth strategy firm, which was all about helping companies figure out what they should do next, particularly when it came to new products. But they had some really brilliant ways of working, which still influence me to this day. And what they were really good at, one of the things they were really good at was visual recording, because that's what we called it there. But in many ways, it was sketchnoting. And so we do a lot of working with clients where you do a workshop, you bring all the right people in the room, and you have put some like provocative questions about like the nature of the project we're trying to tackle, what are the biggest challenges and so on. And then somebody on our team would be up there with a big whiteboard capturing the conversation and trying to get down the key ideas, and so they didn't get lost. And I've always had an interest in this, like the ideas don't get lost in this sort of ether. You're like, you had a conversation, some really good ideas, they floated away, somebody wrote down something, but it wasn't necessarily the good things. And I just saw the power of like, you take a conversation and you put it up real time on the board, and it steers the conversation because it helps people come back to previous concepts that have been raised. So somebody says, oh, the way I think of it is like this and this and this, and you put them up, and then later in the conversation people can see that on the board and they come back to that. And because that was like a core skill there, they really helped people develop with how to capture ideas in real time on a board, and even down to like really basic things like how to properly hold a whiteboard pen so that you don't end up with like a thin line and then a thick line when you didn't mean to, and that the color is even as you go, and what size letters should you be so that people all around the room can always read it wherever they are. How do you keep your handwriting straight so that it doesn't end up looking like a mess? And we'd often like take pictures of these at the end and present them and use them as like a record of the discussion that we had. And they were really valuable, I think, artifacts from the design process, but really for a purpose. And I think the other thing I think that Jumpstart was really interesting with was it wasn't just physical things, but a lot of it was like frameworks or models. You're like visualizing abstract things as well. So like, yeah, the 3 challenges in this, and then you try and visualize 3 challenges. You know, it's sort of an abstract way of thinking of things, or like business 2x2s and things like that. So I kept those skills going since Jump Associates. I worked in user experience and design at my first startup, and I was always like sketching user interfaces and like what would it be, user journeys, mapping out how people are going through your product, that kind of thing. And then back in 2012, I got a Christmas present from my sister, which was they still sell it. It's a lovely book. It's a sketch a day journal, a little green book about that size. And each, if you open it up, there's space for 2 sketches on each side of the page. So that's 4 days worth. And it's literally just draw something a day. And so I did that. And it was really lovely because I'd always enjoyed drawing. I remember being on holidays as a kid and taking a little like sketchbook postcards and stuff like that, and sitting outside in the evening and drawing them. But I didn't find I was doing that art as much during the day anymore. And so it was really nice just to draw something every day. And I found when I got to the end of that, I was like, oh, I kind of miss. It seems a bit of a waste to not be drawing anymore. And then I was like, okay, well, it would be nice also if it helped me in some way. And so I had this idea, well, I'll try and explain something, because that's what I'm trying to do all day is like communicate an idea, communicate a concept. So I'll explain something every day in a sketch. And I did that for a year, one a day. And I don't know, halfway through, I started posting some because they look quite nice. And I had a little moleskin, what are they called? They were storyboard,
yeah. I was guessing that was what that you're using.
Yeah, and they're really lovely. And so it's a very similar format. The small sketchbooks, you open them up, there's 4 frames. Every now and then there's a one with like three frames on one page. And just using that as like, these are my guides. I have to stay within that and do something. And so I did that. And so I started posting them. And somebody said at one point, hey, you should put these online somewhere. And so I started a little Tumblr page and started putting some on Twitter, and people liked them. And so I definitely found that I couldn't easily sustain one a day. But when I finished that, I went to 1 a week. Actually, I went to 2 a week first, and I found that just didn't work at all, because when there's 2 a week, you can always pick tomorrow to do one, as opposed to today. But when there's 1 a week, you got to make it happen. And now I've been doing that for 10 years.
Wow.
Maybe I've learned something.
Wow. Sounds to me like a book opportunity to me, where you could gather, if not all, maybe the best of those sketchplanations and bound those into some kind of a book that people would buy. I would buy that book. I don't know about anybody else, but I think it would be quite nice.
Thank you. Well, you know what? I am actually working on it at the moment.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, after a long time, a publisher got in touch with me, somebody who'd been following the newsletter and with a similar idea. And I've been, a few days a week over the last year trying to assemble everything together, and I've been redoing things and checking things, and it's coming together. Hopefully for next April is the idea.
Oh, great! That would be great. You have to let us know so we can share it with the Sketchnote Army community, so we can definitely get some pre-orders and purchases going for you.
Definitely do that. Thank you.
I know in the publishing business these days, pre-orders are a huge deal. They often publishers give away special tidbits to get you to pre-order. It looks very good on the sales charts. So if we can help in that way, I think the people here would be really your ideal customer for buying that for themselves and others.
Well, I'll definitely take your tips on this. This would be book number 1 for me. So yeah, everything, all your advice is welcome, and all your help there, that'd be brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Well, this is pretty fascinating. It's interesting. Our paths in some ways are parallel. Not exactly, but I was never the best artist either. I just was more practical in the work that I did. So I sort of took what art skill I had and sort of applied it to practical things. And so that has kind of led me on my path. I'm also a user experience designer as well. And I had a period of time for about 3 years where we did very similar things to what you talked about with the whiteboard with developers. So we would queue up software features that needed to be added to our software we were building, and we would sit down on Mondays and queue it up, look at what existed in the old software. Do we like it? How could we improve it? Okay, let's have a discussion. And I would go to the board and document most of it. Occasionally, a developer would ask to come up and draw, which always was my highlight of my day, and they would draw concepts. We would annotate it, take a photo, throw it on a SharePoint space, and sometimes the developers would just take the sketches we did and build right off of that, and other times I'd do mock-ups to kind of move things forward. So when you talked about that, I remembered how enjoyable that was for everybody, really everybody in that group, developers, product owners, business analysts, all seemed to really enjoy it because, as you say, there were these great ideas floating around in the ether. And if no one was attending to that, to try and, I had this idea of like someone catching butterflies with a net. Like if you didn't catch those butterflies and pin them, to the wall, they would be lost because, that person themselves maybe didn't even realize how valuable that idea was. You really needed someone to spot it and then capture it. So I think that's a really valuable way to work.
Yeah, it's interesting that I have two real like contrasting experiences there. Which one was like this engineering world, and if you think of like, you want to see how fast this is going to go when it knocks into that, it's like you draw the diagram, it's all established what the principles are. Like you don't just explain it with words, you draw it out exactly as it's going to happen, right? And then I did some classes in the education department at UC Berkeley, and we were talking about all sorts of really fascinating and difficult topics like reliability and validity, and some concepts from sociology and things like that. And we'd sit in these rooms and have these, do the reading beforehand, come in, and then you talk for an hour, and lots of interesting points will come up, and everybody would just sort of absorb it, I guess, and scribble the odd word down and then walk off. And I remember thinking as I left those classes, like there was some really good stuff there, but I think everybody's going to come out with like a different view of it, and people are going to forget some parts and remember others. And it's just a shame you can't get like some middle ground a bit where you can talk about them things which are a bit more abstract, but actually help give them shape, give them a form that we can all be sure we're talking about the same thing. And that happens in product development so often. You talked about software, where we all talk about an idea and we all assume that we've got the same idea, but in fact we don't. And part of what drawing it on the board is, and like even just sometimes it's words, right? Trying to put it concretely into words is realizing, when you said that, I was thinking of something different. And it just puts this sort of shared space where you can all look at it and go, oh yeah, now we're all on the same page here. And it was fascinating, these discussions in the education department, but I'm sure we left it with all sorts of different ideas, afterwards.
I used to call that, I don't know if I got this term from somewhere or what, but I called it the illusion of agreement. So we all thought we agreed, but we all had different ideas in our head. And if you didn't do something to sort of establish, so I would joke around with people like, okay, what we're doing here is I'm putting things on the board so we have something to argue about, right? To disagree about. Because if you start with something to disagree about, at least you have some starting point, and then you can work toward agreement from there. So, often it wasn't necessarily disagreement, but it was not uncommon for one person to talk about something, and I would draw it on the board, and they'd say, no, that's not exactly what I was thinking. And then I'd hand the marker to them, and they would come up and draw it and make it clear from their perspective. And it sort of gave some solidity or some physicality or something to that idea that then we could say, oh, okay, now I see what you're saying. And now let's have the discussion around that. We would build on it. And, often that would be the solution that would work for us. So that was quite enjoyable.
Yeah, the illusion of agreement is a great term. My thesis in the end was about reframing in the design process, and how you settle as a design team on the framing of the design problem. And a lot of we wrote a paper about how do teams establish a shared frame of things, and some of it is like when you put something out there, the conflicts and the differences become salient, whereas they weren't before. And
Right.
exactly that. You all leave the meeting thinking that, great, we all know what to do. And you all think you've all actually got different ideas in mind about what that is. And when you come back later and you've built the wrong thing, everybody's like, no, that's not what I meant. And so how do you head that off as early as possible? And some of it
Yeah.
is like making it concrete. And that's what the visuals are useful for.
Yeah, maybe the biggest risk in that illusion of agreement walking away is you actually build 5 new things. Well, then which of the 5 will we choose, right? Or is there overlap enough that they could be merged into one thing so that we're not spending energy in 5 directions? We redirect toward one direction and kind of come to an agreement together.
Yeah, love that. And it's the sort of thing I still come across in my day job on a regular basis.
Something else that struck me, and this is just something that struck me and relates to my education, is it sounded like Berkeley did lots of cross training. So there was lots of overlap of departments, or at least for you as a student, you were kind of stepping into a variety of what would seem like unrelated spaces, but yet they are very related. In my education history, I went to a technical school, and they were really, really adamant at that time about this cross training. So if you were a designer, and this is like old school print designer, that's when I went to school, you were required to take photography classes, because in those days you would work with photographers all the time to, describe to them what you're looking for as a designer, and they would inform you. So you had to understand like what are the materials that they work with so you could really understand it. And also printers. So, and I found myself working in the printing room, and because I was so practical, like I would often become almost like a teaching assistant down there, because I had some history taking printing classes prior. So I would be in the design classes, sort of being the assistant to the teacher who often wasn't in the darkroom showing how to shoot films or whatever the thing was we were doing. And so I became sort of this teacher. But I always loved that the cross training, because I felt like I understood more of the holistic job that we were all doing together, even though my part was just one piece of it. Gave me a better appreciation of those and how they fit together. And it sounds like maybe you're doing something like that at Berkeley.
Yeah, one of the things is interesting is the difference, I think, in general between like doing a doctorate in the UK versus often, I think, in the US. Whereas in the UK, typically, like you might find a research advisor who's got a project idea, and you're interested in it too, and it's all sort of settled, and you go off and you do that research, and it takes 3 years, and then you present it. In Berkeley, which I really appreciated, it wasn't expected that you come in knowing what it is exactly you want to do. You're like, I had an idea of what I was interested in, but essentially you spent the first 2 years like taking classes to basically get you to be, I'd say, like getting on for a world expert in each of these areas, really build your knowledge. But that gave you a huge amount of flexibility. And so, yeah, it was brilliant to be able to take classes in the language school. And I remember doing ones on game design, and I took some in the information school and the education department, and just that sort of breadth of knowledge. You never know which ideas are going to be the ones coming in to be useful. And I definitely really appreciated that. Whereas if a traditional way, I was like, I was in design engineering, I stay in the engineering school. That's where I do all my classes. But actually, I think it broadened my outlook and probably improved the end product a great deal by being able to do all that. And I think it's hopefully one of the things I think is interesting about Sketchnotations is I think none of us, just because you work in one area doesn't mean that's the only thing you're good at or the only thing you're interested in. And so it's nice to be able to go, well, here's a thing on well-being or healthcare, and then here's the thing about design, and here's the thing about a business tool, and any of us can appreciate all of those. So yeah, I love the idea of being able to take ideas from lots of different places. It was definitely valuable to me.
Well, we have lots of educators who I think listen to the podcast. So at very least, this can be an encouragement to teachers. Teachers, if you're listening, that doing cross-training with your students is really valuable, even if the students don't realize it in the moment. I certainly had plenty of colleagues in my university, in my technical school, who grumbled that they had to go do photography class or had to do drawing. I'm a printer. Why do I need to do these things? But ultimately, it gave them a better rounded experience. So if you're an educator, if you can find ways to sneak in cross training, Jono and I are big fans of the idea.
100%. 100%.
Well, and now, so you sort of led us to what you're doing these days. What are you currently up to now? Are you working on software? Are you working on hardware? And how does your visualization skills sort of fit into the work you're doing today?
Yeah, so I mean, I split my time at the moment. So a few days a week, I'm working, say right now, on pulling together a book for Sketchnotes and still continuing that. In the day-to-day, I lead a product development team, and 4 product development teams. The company I'm working at is called Zen Educate, and we built a platform that connects schools with substitute teachers. So you can think about it a bit like an Uber or an Airbnb, but for teachers to find work at schools and vice versa. And so we typically, it's just such a really nice sort of area where you're bringing in different skill sets, and you're forced to do that. So you have to have people who know about education, and then you have to have software developers, and you have product manager, and you have a designer, and you try and bring all of that expertise together to create something that is going to provide value for teachers and for schools. I do less of this specific day-to-day design and things than I used to, but both the companies I've worked in the last 10 years, I started when they were very small, and I really like that phase, because you just have to do everything. Otherwise nothing happens. But it's really nice. So you're going out and doing research interviews, but you're also sketching interfaces. You're testing things before they're delivered. You're writing product releases. You're communicating with stakeholders internally or the board members. And all sorts of things. And so my job is a mix of all of that at the moment. And I think we provide a great service for schools, and we actually it's more efficient, so we save schools money, and we can pay teachers more. And we started in the UK, but we've since launched in the US, which is really exciting. So lots to keep me busy on that front too.
That's pretty cool, having those two clients, right? Schools needing on-demand teachers, and then teachers being out there on a bench looking for an opportunity. That you just sort of putting those two things together in a great way. That's pretty cool. Yeah,
and just as an example about where I think of visualization helping in that kind of thing, there's some really, so it's a marketplace. So you've got two sides of a marketplace, and you have to balance supply and demand. And in some ways that's very concrete, because you take a specific job that's available, let's say, and a teacher who wants to do it, and you have to connect them properly. But there's also just how do you think about a marketplace and making this successful? And so there's a nice concept called the Amazon flywheel, and there's another one called, I think it was Uber's virtuous cycle. I did sketches of both of those, and they just help you sort of, you'll see it's a little cycle, the more teachers you have on the marketplace, the better the matches are with the jobs, let's say. So the better the experience for schools, which means they put more jobs available, which means that attracts more teachers. And so you end up with a flywheel. And so the same is true for Amazon's marketplace. The same is true for the density of drivers on Uber or journeys that you can do. And I just think it's interesting how it's fine to talk about that, but it's so different when you put a visualization or something like that. People just get it. You're like, oh yeah, I see how it works. Whereas day to day, there's a million little bits of data points, but trying to communicate abstract ways of thinking about these things is sometimes super valuable. And so I still like it at that sort of level.
Yeah, and I imagine some people, like a developer, let's say, they're looking at this one little piece, I need to deliver this feature, but there is this whole flywheel or thing happening, and they can see their position within it and why it's important what they're doing, right? So it gives meaning in a lot of ways, where if you just were heads down pounding away on this feature, it wouldn't maybe have the same meaning to you, right? Hey, I'm part of this flywheel, where our goal is to really get this moving forward and let it have its own momentum.
Yeah, everybody needs a connection to what's the point of what you're doing. There's I don't know if you come across Dan Pink's really nice framework, autonomy, mastery, purpose, about motivation. And so I did a sketch of that, and I think the purpose side of it is just so why am I doing what I'm doing? It's not exciting for me to be just creating this button. But if this button is going to do this, and that's going to enable this bigger picture thing, then yeah, keeps you getting up every day.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Well, this has been really, really interesting and fascinating. We'll have to look around a little bit, and if you've got those particular concepts in sketchplanations, maybe we can have some direct links to those, so those who are listening or watching can pop them up on the screen and take a peek. So we'll work on that for the show notes later. This episode of the Sketchnote Army Podcast is brought to you by Concepts, a perfect tool for sketchnoting, available on iOS, Windows, and Android. Concepts' infinite canvas lets you sketchnote in a defined area while still enjoying infinite space around it to write a quick note, scribble an idea, or keep pre-drawn visual elements handy for when you need them most. The infinite canvas lets you stretch out and work without worrying if you'll run out of space. And when combined with powerful vector drawing that offers high resolution output and complete brush and stroke control, you have a tool that's perfect for sketchnoting. Search Concepts in your favorite app store to give it a try. Let's shift now to your tools. I'm always really fascinated by the tools people use. Sometimes they're pretty common, and sometimes I'm surprised. And let's start with analog first. It seems like you do analog drawing, or at least you used to when I first encountered you. Have you made a shift to digital, or you still feel really good about the pen and paper feel? And what pens and paper do you like?
Yeah, I'm always a bit conflicted because this digital just has these massive advantages.
Yeah.
But I still, there's nothing that quite is come close to the feeling of just writing in a notebook. So I don't know, I do have it alongside me here. So I have this kind of daily notebook that I'll always take, and so that's got like my mixes of to-do lists, or here's a UI idea, or here's me sketching out this framework, or here's a mind map for content for this talk. I tend to for the analog stuff, so I still do carry around a physical notebook, but my preference are dotted notebooks. I just I say I was always interested in creative problem solving. I just think dotted just solves the problem. Like, it basically looks like it's a blank page, which is lovely, but it allows you to structure data and actually like do things in straight lines, and it helps guide your drawings without getting in the way of the content. It was Edward Tufte has this idea of a ghost grid. So there's a grid behind the whole thing, which doesn't get in the way, and you don't really notice it at the end. So anyway, I really like the dotted notebooks. This one is a leech term. I never know how to pronounce it.
Yeah, which German company, really good quality
journal. But probably most of my ones I've had are the Moleskine. They're about, I don't know, a bit bigger than A5. The large ones with a sort of flexible leather cover, and they do some really nice dotted ones as well. I've tried plain, and plain looks lovely if you're just drawing, but if you're also making lists or structuring stuff and you want things to be in straight lines, the dotted is just so much better. I think usually I like ones with bright colors. That one's black, but
I've got my bright colored Leuchtturms here as well.
Absolutely.
And I think Leuchtturm has done a really great job of finding that right gray level. So as an old printer, like, I know how tricky it is. They must use some kind of a special color, but it's like just dark enough that you see it, but light enough that it fades in the background. Some dotted notebooks don't do as good a job with this, and the dots are too dark, and they become noise. And so it's really, you don't appreciate it until you come across a notebook where they don't pay attention to those details, and it just constantly gets in your way. So I think Leuchtturm has done a good job with that.
Yeah, a lot of if people are giving out free notebooks, normally they're lined ones. I just can't get on with lined ones.
Yeah, it's not for me either. Not unless I'm writing a journal. But even in a journal, I would just use dotted as well, because it's got just enough structure. What about pens? It sounds like you're using Moleskine and Leuchtturm primarily.
For pens, I'm heavily influenced by what we had at Jump Associates, which I just think worked beautifully. I actually can't find them very easily now, but there are some Uniball Vision Elite pens, which are my prefer just everyday pens, and they do nice sets of colors now, but I honestly just quite like the blacks and the blues. There's just something about, they have just like the right beautiful clean lines, and they're dark and they're bold and they're smooth to write with, and they don't bleed through too much. You get the right thickness ones, but Uniball Vision Elites are the ones I like. And then I always used to carry I usually have two pens in my pocket at any one time, but a black and then a highlight color like a green or a red, and then I would have a Copic marker with me. Is why I was used to carry around, like usually a gray or sort of beige Copic marker, just to allow you to give a little background, a little shape to things. And I just think that just made a huge difference. I think when I was doing a lot of paper stuff, I'd also have like a bright color Copic marker as well for highlighting stuff, but not so much anymore. But I mean, they've strongly influenced, because I started analog, all the Sketchnotations. They're basically, I keep to a simple color palette and often a bit of just gray in the background, and that's the influence of those pens.
Yeah, and I can just imagining, I'm not looking at one of your Sketchnotations, but all those things you just said, black with a highlight color and a shadow is sort of like, the recipe for a Sketchnotation, and a square, right? Sort of those basic elements, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know if a square necessarily. I'm looking around because I have a bunch on my wall.
I see some behind you now. Yeah.
yeah. I have a few of my favorite ones. But there is something about like, just I think back to the storyboard notebooks, which I do still really like. They just give you this frame to work in, and sometimes the constraint is just really helpful. You're like, okay, it's got to work in here.
And what about digital? Are you using some kind of digital tool? You sound like you were conflicted when you first began, so I suspect that's true.
Yeah, I did. So I don't know when it was, like 5 or 6 years ago. I moved to an iPad Pro when the iPad Pro and the Pencil first came out. I think I still have the sort of initial large iPad Pro, the sort of A3 size, A3, A4 size one.
The big one, yeah.
Yeah, which I mean, they're probably much better now, but it still works. It still works really nicely, and I think the Pencil's still pretty good. So I do, all of the Sketchnotations I do now with that. But I don't know, if I'm still just doing it, if I'm sketching a user interface quickly or something, I'll do that in my notebook and take a quick photo and send it in Slack or something. And then you said that most people use Procreate. I have Procreate installed. I don't use Procreate.
Interesting.
Yeah, I use something called Sketchbook Pro. I don't know if you've come across that.
Yeah, of course.
So it was an Autodesk one, but their free version is really good, and they added a little thing that you can pay for that allows you to do a few extra bits, which is just super useful. I usually think, like, that phrase that the best camera is the one you have with you.
Yeah,
it's kind of like, it doesn't really matter. Like, what's more important is that you're able to write stuff down or make a note when you're inspired, and that you just get to know your tools. Like, I'm sure I could get really good at Procreate, but I've kind of got Sketchbook Pro does what I want now. And so, maybe one day I'll try something different, but it does what I want. And that's more important, like, is knowing your tools, I think, than which tool
I'm using. Yeah, it's simple and effective, and you're fluent. So, if you want to get yourself out of the way, if you're fiddling with tools, that's not a good thing when you're trying to get a concept out, because, like you say, that whatever's floating around in your head in the ether could get lost just as well, right? So you want to move quick and catch it before it disappears. So that's Autodesk's app is a classic. It's been around, I think, since the beginning of the iPad. I think they ported it pretty early, so it's been around for quite a long time. I've run into a few other people that use it. I use Paper by WeTransfer in that way. I just know the tool really deeply, and if I need to get a concept out, I just pop it up and it's there and I go with it. So in a similar way, but I do use Procreate for illustration work. If I know that my work will be scaled or I need modifications, Concepts is great for that because it's vector based. So it gives me that additional level of control. So I've been starting to try and be more specific around what is the task that I want to do, and then I choose the tool to fit it. But Paper is sort of my default. If I don't have to choose, I'll go there first. And then if I have a specific need, I go to these other tools. And I, like you, I have to force myself, because I would just be comfortable using this one tool. But illustrations have to be a certain resolution. Paper just doesn't, it's not set up that way. It's not that kind of a tool. So I needed to move into Procreate, and it's been a great tool for that. And same thing with concepts when those illustrations need to be scalable. It's been a great tool for that. So I feel fortunate, but it's hard. Like when you invest a lot of time in a tool, it's an intentional move to spend time on another tool, because you have to learn all that new stuff, and you almost need like a project. You can't just do it fiddling around, because there's not enough motivation. You really need a project, I think, to make you motivated to see results. So that's really interesting.
I think because Sketchplanations is weekly, I never feel like I quite have enough time in a week to like transition to something new. So I've never made the switch to try out new things. I was just like, right, well, let's keep going with this one, because I know it's going to work right now. So
that seems like a good fit for that purpose then.
Yeah. I mean, any of these tools, you see like people can draw beautiful, unbelievable things in all of them. So if they can do that, surely this one's good enough for me. So
yeah. I'm kind of curious, do you ever I'm assuming you must have a huge backlog of potential topics that you could draw, or do you struggle every week like, oh man, what am I going to draw? It's Thursday, I better hurry up and pick a topic, and okay, got it done Friday. Phew, okay, I hope I have something next week. Is it tend to be one side or the other, or do you have like a huge stack of like logs waiting for you to pick and burn in the fire?
Yeah. Have you ever read the book? I think there was one about Bill Watterson and Calvin and Hobbes, and how he drew Calvin and Hobbes.
I haven't read that one. That would be fun.
I forget exactly what it's called, but there's one. It was an extended interview with him about his process from the museum where they have his work. And I think I do it a little bit like he did it, which is what he often would do, is like come up with a number of like ideas for strips, sometimes like draw them out just really roughly, and then sometimes he would go through and ink them, and then later on he would come through and color them, let's say, and so at any one point he might have 3 or 5 of them on the go, and like do a day where he's like inking them, or do a day when he's coloring them all. And so I'm a little bit more like that. So I have ones in various stages of being done. So I do have a giant backlog of like, oh, that would be a cool sketch. One day I should do that. That keeps coming up. But I also have lots of draft sketches where I've started something, or I'm like, oh, actually, one day I put down 3 ideas of 3 different sketches and how I might do it. And then one week I might come across and do 2 of those and then post one of them. That kind of thing. So I always have this multi-stream approach. And also, I think for me, sometimes, I guess it's kind of like this with any art. Like you get to the end and it looks totally straightforward, but often I had to get through a lot of thinking in order to get there. And so sometimes just like put in even if I pick, I'm going to do this one this week, and I put that down the Friday before, and my brain can be turning that over through the days over the next week. And so I've actually by Wednesday I've come up with a great example for it, and then I'll draw it on Thursday, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's kind of my process. But I do have a giant list, and people send me great ideas all the time. So the ideas come in faster than I can draw them, for sure.
If you think about it in the plant term, it's like you've got a big bucket of seeds, and then you're planting these plants and you're watering them through constantly. And then when it seems like that one's ready, you pull it forward and finish it up and push it out, and another seed comes and gets planted, and you keep on watering. And it's sort of like the gardener of Sketchplanations.
That's a nice metaphor. Yeah, I like it. That's exactly how I meant to describe it.
There you go. So, Jono, tell us some tips you have for us. I like to frame it as someone's listening, they're a visual thinker of some kind, but they maybe feel like they're hit a plateau. And I like to ask guests to give them encouragement. What would be 3 tips that you would tell someone like that to encourage them? Can be anything, can be mental tips, it can be practical tips, bring an extra pencil, something like that. So I'll leave it to you, but just 3 tips would be great.
Yeah. So I gave a little bit of thought to this, and I came up with some which I think are maybe disarmingly simple, perhaps. So the first one is I have a concept. I actually have a mouse mat of it right here, which is
Mm.
the first draft is always perfect. And I really like this framing because it basically says like you're like your first draft is probably going to be rubbish, but that's okay because that's the job of the first draft, and that's what makes it perfect. And so I guess my experiences there was when I'm stuck or I'm not sure what to do, I just had to make myself do anything. And actually,
Yeah.
I find just doing something is enough to like unblock it, and getting away from this idea that whatever you're going to do is going to be great is just very liberating. And so this idea of the first draft is always perfect is a nice way to come to me. I have another sketch, actually it's up on my wall, which is called the Doorstep Mile, which is this really nice Scandinavian concept, I think, which is just like getting started can be the hardest part, which is like stepping out of your door. Like it's easy to go for a run once you've got your trainers on and you're out of your door. So you just have to get started. So first draft is always perfect. There's definitely, I strongly believe like this idea that great ideas come during the hard work and not before it. So like you don't have to have your great idea and then start work. Usually all the best ideas I've had are while I'm doing the work. So to get started. The second tip I would have is to keep it simple. And the reason I say that is because I think it's easy to have really high expectations about, you know, what things are going to turn out like. But actually, in many ways, simple stuff is just as helpful as complex stuff. And sometimes it's even more useful. I'm reminded of some diagrams which have been super helpful at work and in discussions where people literally just boxes and lines with text in. Like anybody can do boxes and lines. Sometimes I find on like just laying out words, like if there's a process, I like lay out the words in an order. I'm like, oh yeah, this one becomes before that one, and I find that is valuable and clarifying to me, and it doesn't have to be like a complex visual in any ways. And I think the other aspect to keep it simple, I think definitely for me it was, but it's easy to get thrown by drawing people, and you'll see obviously like in Sketchnotations, my people are super simple. Just a little bit more than the stick man, but there are lots of ways actually to draw really simple people, which just allow you to put a person in there, but not get hung up on the drawing of the person. And you know, like drawing a star, it kind of looks like a person. You can do somebody jumping, and that's fine, and that gets the idea across. And it doesn't have to be perfect. So keeping it simple is my second tip. And my third tip is keep going. So my experience again is that I've done so many drawings where about halfway through they looked pretty rubbish. And I think often, you know, people ask me about, oh yeah, how can I learn to draw? And I very much believe like it's easy to start drawing something and it look rubbish and then just stop and then assume that you couldn't do it or you weren't getting there. And so often, I mean, partly the nice thing about Sketchnotations is it's like clockwork. It's going to make me do it. So I just keep going. And there's very often times where halfway through, it felt like it wasn't working. The drawing wasn't right. You know, like if you saw all my the sketches along the way, sometimes they're awful, but you keep going at it and you refine this bit and you change this bit and you switch the direction. And then after a while, you get to a point where it looks really good. And it's so easy to assume that people just come across and do the good thing straight away. But so my tip is just, even when you look at it, is to keep going. There was in my research, there was a guy called Donald Schoen, who's an architect, and he did a lot of research about how do you teach and learn architecture, and he talked about drawing as a reflexive conversation with the situation, which takes a while to get your head around, but the idea is that you put a line on the page and then you see that line and that line informs your next line, and so there's this constant like back and forth, and like, oh, I put this down and it doesn't quite fit, so I moved it over there, and I erased this bit and I moved it over there, and you're doing these hundreds of iterations just while you're just still working on it. And but you don't get that if you just stop on your first bit when it didn't come out like you wanted to. So those are my three ideas. Yeah, first draft is always perfect. Keep it really simple. You keep going.
Those are three great Pretty great tips, and I wholeheartedly believe in each one, and was imagining moments in my experience where I felt the same way, especially number two, like getting partway into something and thinking, oh, this is not going the way I want. I'll just say, well, I'll just keep going a little bit more. Let's tweak that a little bit. And a lot of times I found that the thing that I thought was going nowhere was a problem halfway through. By the time I get done with it, it's like one of my favorite things, because there was really potential there that I had to unearth that potential and keep working it until it developed into the thing. Like you kind of fell in love with it, which is kind of a fun experience. So yeah, definitely believe in that.
I always love like the making of things, and like I went to see, there's a random gallery in Washington State where they had a Dr. Seuss exhibition, and it had like his sketches before the final books, and it's just always fascinating seeing people's process and realizing it's probably just as messy and confused as yours is, and it's quite liberating. Whenever we watch films, I'm always more interested in the making of the film than the film itself. Not
if you happen to be a Star Wars fan and watch Mandalorian, there was a really great series in addition to the show where it talks about how they made it and some of the crazy stuff they went through to achieve these, what at the outset seemed like impossible. How are we going to do that? They had some crazy idea, and they, through process and everybody being creative, they were able to solve it. And you get to see how they achieved it. And when you watch the episode, it's, you wouldn't even think of all the hoops that they're jumping through to make that happen, but yet they pulled it off. So yeah, in the Absolutely. Same way. I love that. Yeah. Love it. Well, thanks so much for those tips, Jono. And I think our next step is talking about how we can get a hold of you and find you. So why don't you let us know what's the best place to find you?
Yeah, so the best place to find me is on the internet, sketchnotations.com, or if you type in Jono Hey or Sketchnotations of some combination, you'll find it. As I say, I think we also did a podcast earlier this year exploring some of the topics on that we talked about in the sketches and digging into that, which was really fun too. And that's sketchnotations.com/podcast.
Another podcast about visual things. So we have at least two.
Absolutely. I know it sounds a bit crazy, but actually, it's been a lot of fun doing it.
Yeah, just like I agree. Well, for those who are watching or listening, we'll make sure and get lots of good show notes and links for you. Jono's going to look up some of these things we've talked about and provide links to you. We'll have, of course, links to the site and the podcast and all that stuff. But this wraps another episode of the Sketchnote Army Podcast. So until next time, talk to you soon.
Cheers, Mike.
See ya. The Sketchnote Army Podcast was created by me, Mike Rohde, and brought to you by Rohdesign Studios. It's produced and edited by Alec Polianis of AMP Creative Studios. The theme music was created by John Schiedermeyer. To support the creation of this show, I invite you to buy one of my books, the Sketchnote Handbook or the Sketchnote Workbook. You can find the books on Amazon or go to peachpit.com and use the code ROHDE40 for 40% off. Please share this podcast with other visual thinking friends, and be sure to leave a nice rating on iTunes or your favorite podcast listening app so others can find the show.